Hello and welcome to the Armen Show podcast. Delightful science, creativity, learning more, always expanding our framework, and the network of connections builds over time, which is fabulous. Kind of like this bookshelf behind me over time. On this show here, we have a returning guest. She has a bookshelf too, by the way. You can see it if this is in both video ends at this moment, unless the thing edits to switch. But there's a bookshelf in the background, and it has cool angles and stuff. I've been looking at everything in detail, but we'll get into that. But my guest today, Anarchy, we talked about it in episode 433, Dr. Sophie Scott-Brown. She's a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews and future fellow at Remark Institute, New York University. Long live New York, and meetings there. She's also founder of the Everyday Democracy Project with Open Society Foundation. She wrote the book about Raphael Samuel, and also the one we spoke about last time, Colin Ward.
Indeed.
And Everyday Anarchy. Sophie, welcome back to the program.
Pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
Delightful to have you on. We support this. A lot of topics, messages, quotes, and concepts I would want to cover here after looking into your material more so.
Fab, go for it.
This is great. Now, before I get into that, so there's a bit of current context, which is always good. At the current moment, what are some topics, items, projects you are looking into? What's currently happening in the world of anarchy and such? And then we'll get into material.
Right, well, so I'm just going to start with a bit of shameless self-promotion, like all good anarchists should. So I have another book coming out later this summer, and it's looking all about, I've moved away from people who call themselves anarchists, and I'm finding anarchy everywhere, even in the absolute peak of the first Cold War. So my forthcoming book is going to look at all these different kind of anarchic community and activist experiments that were happening mostly in Britain, but with some glances across the pond to you good folks in the US and also into Europe. So having a look at what people were doing at another moment in history where things seem really to have fallen apart, and that all faith or trust in large political systems was very much eroded. So people were thinking, great, well, if it's up to us and we have to do it, what does that look like? What does that feel like? So I spent quite a long time working on that, and that's coming out soon. The other thing I've been up to is recently I've been working with the David Graeber Institute, fantastic institute. Recently it was David's birthday, or it would have been, on the 12th of February, and I was very honoured and privileged to be invited to do a little bit of a talk about David Graeber's account of anarchism and how it has influenced me, and also the places where David and I diverge, because that's natural and that's what you would want, but nevertheless he's an extremely important influence for me, and I think his ideas are really resonant for the current moment that we're in. So those are the sort of main kind of highlights on my agenda so far. Obviously, been doing a lot of thinking and talking about anarchy, particularly in the current moment. A lot of fending off the question about whether what's happening in America right now is anarchy. No, it's not. But if only it was. And yes, so that's been what I've been up to.
Folks, no, it's not. For those who thought it might have been, that's not the case. Oh, that's actually a good one to look at first. What is thought of anarchy versus what is anarchy? The commonly viewed perception of it versus what it actually is. What's the big difference there, or how can you differentiate those two?
Sure. So I'll actually borrow some of the comments that I've been sending off just to illustrate this, because I think it actually does a really good job. So we're hearing quite a lot in the media and stuff like that what's happening in America right now, amongst the American government, it's anarchy. And when people use that term, what they actually mean is it's unpredictable and it's volatile. Like every day brings something fresh up, something which people never thought would happen is happening, and in extraordinarily quickly and in very sort of remarkable and unpredictable ways. But that's not anarchy. We discussed this last time. Anarchy is actually really Simple. It means no rules, no governance. So when you have a group of people who are kind of dependent on exercising an awful lot of coercive force in order to do whatever it is they want to do whenever they want to do it, then that's not anarchy. It's autocracy gone feral, if you like. Yeah, that's sort of one way of kind of getting into the thinking behind it. That what we're actually seeing is not an age of anarchy, although I think, as we might discuss later, if ever there was a good time, now is it. What we're seeing is the kind of collapse of one kind of authority and order, one based on rules and prediction and knowledge and expertise, and the rise of an alternative kind, which is based much more on the personality and the individual, the big man, the strong man leader, and in the case of Italy, strong woman. And so we're not officially in an age of anarchy, but we could be, and perhaps we should be.
Bring up a point about force. It made me think of when there's a dynamic, one above the other, and then there's force. Now there is no longer, you've killed both. I have this concept like if you put something into a cage and you think you captured it, you didn't capture anything. You've ruined the thing you captured. If it was a bird, now it can't fly. And it is messed up, and now you didn't get what you thought you wanted. Both sides lose in that capacity. Any thoughts on that kind of thing where it's a lose-lose?
I think you've nailed it. In some ways, anarchy is wonderfully elusive as a concept. If you think about other ideologies, liberalism, socialism, Marxism, conservatism, fascism, they kind of tell you up front what they want. They positively want something about the world. They want to see the ideas of Marx realized. They want to see more liberty. They want to see more equality. They want to see traditional order restored, whatever it may be. But anarchy just tells you what it doesn't want. It doesn't want to be enclosed. It doesn't want to be confined. And so it's one of those pesky things that whenever you think you've pinned it down or nailed it, you've either kind of turned it into the opposite of what it actually is, or you just simply have nothing. But so obviously people then are fairly remarked to me, well, how is that helpful then? How on earth could I possibly use this? But I think what will be interesting right now is to think more about anarchy as this sort of escapist energy, if you like, this sort of centrifugal force which can never bear enclosure or capture, ideological capture. So it's always trying to disrupt anything that's going to kind of close us in or brick us up, and it's always wanting to open up and explore and find new connections and new ways, new patterns of living together. So in the world, in the current state that it's in now, facing the kind of problems that it faces right now, trying to enclose everything into systems, whether that's through rules and laws and policies and expertise, or whether it's through one individual, the rebirth of the Leviathan, if you like, who's got the flexibility to change on a penny, which actually can be quite a good thing with problems that are fast changing and dynamic. But the bad thing is that's going to be arbitrary. It's going to be based quite often on whimsy. It may not always be based on a full enough picture of the information available. So neither of those options are working for us. So how about this more creative, this more pluralistic, this more explorative political energy? What it will mean, though, is we're going to have to seriously rethink what it means to do politics. And that's quite scary.
It is scary for the individual that needs that sort of encapsulation on top of what's happening, but not scary for the individual that already has the internal base in place and then doesn't need that type of hefty structure to feel comfortable. But that is a very rare individual from what I have.
Well, I'd actually take exception to that. In some ways, I think we all have that in us and we all live our lives like that in some degree. Very few of us, a tiny minority, would need, and maybe that minority may have very good reason or rationale too, but very few of us need to structure or be able to predict or control absolutely every element of our lives. What happens, however, is all that sort of capacity for improvisation, spontaneity, openness, sort of free interaction, free association. We're kind of not told that's important or valuable. It's certainly not what we're trained to kind of cultivate in education. Perhaps maybe if you go through a much more arts-driven education, but I think it's fair to say that in most countries in the world right now, the arts are not something that's being particularly kind of encouraged, or they're certainly not flourishing in the UK. I would imagine the same's true in the US. So for the most of the time, all those sort of that capacity, that potential we've got to explore that side that's within us all, that comes out in our relationships with people, with friends, with just in the course of our very, very ordinary daily life. Because we're not taught to care or value about any of that stuff, we focus on what we are taught to do, which is rely on rules, rely on systems, and defer to them, and defer our authority, our capacity for decision making to experts of some form or another, or authority figures of some form or another. So I think it's more of us have this capacity in us, not inevitably, but we have a capacity in us, more of us than we think.
I am with this one. What I was detailing is that's a good distinction right there. The capacity is there for, I would say, the vast majority, but then a good chunk of the population gets, I mean, if I use the stress hormone glucocorticoid, they get glucocorticoided in or pigeonholed in some sort of description where they didn't really want it to be that way, and then okay, it's a little bit more comfortable. Eventually, oh wait a minute, I'm not doing the things that I wanted to do. Maybe there's a small group that is able to do that and wanted to do that. A large group that wanted to do that but did not figure out a way to get to that, or was subjugated in some way, and then maybe some that run the program in some form. Right. I think more have the capacity than is showing up in our society.
Mm-hmm. And there was a very interesting American thinker, Paul Goodman, who basically articulated that as a new class theory. He anticipated that this was going to be more like what was going to happen to class in the post-war, post-affluence world, that you would have a group of people who may not want to be living the way they were, but found ways to be about as comfortable as possible. And, they are sort of rewarded for this by getting small little comforts that ease their passage through life, that kind of try and compensate for the fact they're not really kind of doing or being or living how they want to. So they're the sort of vast majority, with a smaller majority that actually get really into doing this and kind of, go native, if you like, within the system. And then a tiny little sprinkling that just don't fit and have to go outside of the system. So that was Paul Goodman's theory of class, 1960.
1960s. An important point there is that anything that is understood about people over time, once it's figured out, we haven't really changed much. So it's good that if something was figured out in 1840, 1960, 1720, and it matches us, until we have some sort of different processing in our minds, it's going to be accurate to our dynamics.
I'll use any idea going if it does what I need it to do.
The internet is always based on, this is a separate topic, but the internet's always based on now and the thing that came out yesterday and the new thing, which is cool. But in the grand space of items, that last thing, the chance of it being very valuable compared to what's been there for a long time, it's a tough competition. Tough competition. Now, one thing that came to mind about people guiding their own path, it was related to law enforcement. It was a quote that I saw from Armen Shirvanian. An anarchist is someone who doesn't need a cop to make him behave. So this is something about the person already having it within versus, oh, okay, I follow the guidelines set before me, and that's I look up there for what it is, versus the person that just does. What are your thoughts on that matter?
Well, I think this is a really kind of hot topic in anarchism, because there are a certain handful of questions that inevitably come up whenever you start to kind of stray anywhere near the idea that you might be an anarchist. The first one being, well, nobody would work, so no one would do anything, and nobody would do the dirty jobs, and everyone would commit crime, and how would we police that, bar from fairly barbaric kind of popular justice mob mentality kind of, which obviously we don't want. And it's sort of a tricky one to start even beginning to unpick. So the kind of quote that you refer to, there is a school of anarchism that says, well, actually, if you look a bit more closely, flip the question on its head. What is kind of going on in, let's not all, but an awful lot of crime. If you look closely, it cannot be separated from all the usual suspects: inequality, poverty, unequal life choices, previous histories of abuse or injustice going back very, very far, even crimes that are committed owing to a lot of mental health problems that have gone either undiagnosed or inadequately treated or inadequately supported. There is, I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to say is this notion that that we must have law and order because human nature is intrinsically bad, and even if it doesn't really kind of even if it's not sort of maliciously bad, it's just hardwired to be selfish, and therefore in the desire to realize its own security or ambition, it's going to be aggressive and violent to all those who it perceives as a threat or a challenge. I think, I think it's a great thing anarchists do when they challenge any sort of essential account of what human nature is or isn't. Equally, anarchists can go the other way a bit too far and overemphasize our capacity for sociability, that we're all just, if only we were living a bit more, just, equal, fair, happy lives, and none of us would commit crime because we wouldn't feel the need to steal, we wouldn't feel the need to gain more status, we wouldn't feel jealousy over other people's possessions, property being probably one of the most mobilizing concepts in crime, in law, in legislation, even things like murder, the idea that kind of you might kill somebody who is sort of in some ways infringing your capacity for status, to gain more, to stand kind of where you wish to be in the world. Property's kind of just lurking in that mixture all the time. So if we get rid of all that which is superficial, which has been dumped on top, and then we've all been conned into thinking we must have law and order because we've got this sort of terrible nature, but in actual fact it's a social structure, so it's a big vicious circle that laws kind of legitimate crimes, and so on and so round the circle we go. That can be, for my money, possibly sometimes too optimistic to think that if we just, sorted out all these problems, we'd all live wonderful, happy, cooperative lives. That's not what humans are. We do struggle, we do conflict, we do have very different views of the world, very different kinds of experiences, and that's what is rich and satisfying for kind of humans to be. I tend to come at this, my approach is not to give a solution, not to say, right, well, here's an alternative, and then list all the sort of other ideas we could have for how people could sort out problems. Although that said, I think it's, a lot of these sorts of notions about how you get communities far more involved and engaged in how they solve their own problems and how they kind of regulate or respond to disruptions or disturbances in their midst. I think all that's great. I don't think it happens overnight. I think it's also always got to be done sort of slowly and spontaneously, with a kind of gradually evolving capacity to do that. Otherwise, it will just fall into another sort of routine or pattern. I mean, you might prefer the word sort of tribunal to law court. You might think tribunals got much more connotations of fairness and openness and participation, but actually a tribunal can be just as dictatorial as a law court. So I suppose my first step, and I'm all about the first step, really, I don't want to bound on too many miles ahead of anyone else, because I believe in collaborative decision making. So the first step is actually just to start questioning a bit more some of the assertions we make and the assumptions we have around law and around order. Laws, what are they? They're codifications of the ways humans can and should interact together. I think we're completely welcome to examine those and see if they still apply, or whether they belong to another time and place and actually they don't fit the way we're living anymore. That's actually a natural process of change. And what I'm saying is, to some degree, that happens in the legal system. I think it should happen in public. It should be a collective property and a collective process.
that concept, I see that concept in many different angles of life, where there is the person and there's a group, and then suddenly, oh, okay, I have an idea, but there's like a connected thought with, I have the idea for how to do things better for the group, but this idea will also set me above the group. Oh boy. And then whatever that thought is then starts to create, okay, I better create a system so that it keeps me where I am, and then they are there because I did the thing before they did the thing. And then if you don't keep things at little pieces, then it starts to build up into another that on top of that. But if it's kept at little pieces or looked at by the group lightly, then it has less likelihood to become this entrenched thing.
Part of democracy has to be, quite often we think of participatory democracies, we get handed a problem, like, crime's a problem, everyone, get together, here are your options, discuss your favorite one. That's not democracy. Actually, democracy has to be involved in defining or framing what the problem is, creating what our objective, our kind of objective inquiry is going to be. Otherwise, like you say, many, the history of anarchism, anarchist philosophy, anarchist theory and thinking has been littered with people who have that instinct to try and sort of, I think it comes from a really good place. It's trying to show everyone all the possible ways of life that you could live that wouldn't actually need a permanent source of centralized authority and administration. The incredible potential that we've all got to be much more involved, and not in any sort of rigid republic types, as people's council, citizens assemblies way, but just in a very spontaneous cultural way, like how much more power we could assert over educating ourselves and our children and our communities, how much we could be involved in our neighborhoods and what they look like and how they operate, our workplaces and all that sort of thing. It doesn't always have to be sitting on that very high formal level. But when anarchists have done this over too much and they've come up with some brilliant ideas, sometimes the tail starts wagging the dog, right? And we become overly fixated with these particular forms of how you might live without governance, and we forget that actually anarchy is the spirit behind that, which is the spirit of let's come together and let's sort of give shape to what our concern is, and then imagine how we kind of, or not, give shape to our experience together and then go forward with that reasonably unscripted. It does put me in a tricky position though, because as an academic, as a doctor, people always kind of, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to live without this, do this? And it always looks like I haven't done my homework when I say to them, I can't tell you that without falling into immediate contradiction with myself. However, I could suggest 10 ways that we might all get together and have a really interesting discussion, which will show you that you've got far more power sitting in your own hands. Is that, if that's not too awful a mixed metaphor, far more power in your own hands than simply demanding that a government does it, or a police officer does it, or a court judge does it. That actually, I'm really interested in hearing what people think they can do, and that's a good start for me. And that's a really good start for most people.
Highly important point here, resonates with me substantially. The question already starts to negate that thought pattern. So it's like, okay, so how do we, already the question has this tone of like, let's get it back to some sort of that.
Precisely.
Can you not be, but the whole point of that is to sit in this way, the open-ended, reaching for items, trying to figure things out, personal effort to come up with a solution. The moment that now that person is saying, well, you should this, we're doing it again, and then we're not getting away from that. So it's more of sitting in that kind of spirit that you mentioned, the word spirit, versus this kind of, I don't know if you ought to even call it spirit, but whatever that is.
Energy. Into a different form of energy.
Right. And that's the main, so you can't, it's a question that's unanswerable when asked in a certain way, because the question is now setting it up for a repeat. I've noticed that many a time. We don't want to repeat in that way. I have this one quote that I saw, and then there's a question related to it here, which slightly connects. So if you don't fit in, then you're probably doing the right thing, is the quote. Does this suggest a tension between individuality and community? How does an anarchist reconcile these two competing values?
Well, again, it's like, again, there's been a tendency within a lot of anarchist philosophy and theory, even very sophisticated forms, to kind of, you know, um, sort of have the very many tribes of anarchy. So you've got your social anarchists who say, right, well, we can't possibly have. Social anarchists will describe to you a form of social arrangement that doesn't have a centralized government or permanent authority structure. But actually, that doesn't mean, as we've just discussed, that it's free from authority. There are different ways to sneak authority into that kind of a system. And then there are your individualists, and the social anarchists are supposed to be very opposed to the individualists, because the individualists, these sort of, kind of in their liberal form, they're just people who want to go around doing what they do and choosing what they choose and getting what they want. And then there's a kind of a sort of kind of another one, which is a sort of existential one, which that's the kind of individualist anarchist that's gone, you know what? I don't even want to be enslaved by my wants and desires anymore. I'm that much of an individual. I'm that much of an anarchist. So screw you guys. I'm just going to bear the terrible burden of my freedom, and off I go. I come at it from a slightly different perspective, and I sort of see, I don't think anyone, I think people maybe incline one way more than the other, but I actually don't see them as poles apart. I see them as very much conversational. Again, anarchy is a mood, it's an energy. It's sort of like when you are in a situation which is very heavily, being kind of over socialized or overly social engineered, if you like, that's when you need your individualist to come along and poke some holes in the kind of net that's closing in around you. The antinomian, the contrarian that just can't help, everything's going smoothly, and then there's just someone who wants to kind of, chuck a curveball in, and that person's annoying. They're really annoying. I've had students like it, but they're also really important, because even if what they're saying doesn't appear to make sense, or it just appears to be absurd or destructive, actually it's inviting us to kind of throw the pieces back in the air and not get too embedded or encrusted in one particular pattern, which might be nice and cozy for a long time until it's not. But then if we've never got the capacity to reform patterns, then obviously we reach situations where we feel very helpless to deal with problems that are beyond the scope of our familiar languages, familiar patterns of living. So yay for the antinomian, until, however, you've got a situation where you've got too many of them going around, and actually then, once again, their individuality becomes curbed and limited, because they're being individual within a settled social system, right? And in this particular case, it's a neoliberal one. So if they're the sort of individual that says, I just want to do what I want, well, what you want is directly related to the kind of experiences that are open to you to have physically, literally, as a kind of socialized human being living within an economy and a political system and a society. So always those two, I think, instead of individual and social, it's that kind of critical create, which sort of, it's a tango. It's they love each other, they hate each other, they love each other, they hate each other, and that's the best way I can think of. Anarchy is a tango. There you go. My quote for the day.
Quoted. Tango is key. Critic and create, the pairing, it's not that far off from expansion and consolidation, which I've always paired together. You need, and by the way, the thing you described of the somewhat annoying person, before I would do that quite a bit more often earlier on in my existence. I've reduced it publicly and kept it privately, which is wonderful, but publicly I would do it because, if you don't poke holes in things over time, vulnerability is going up and up and up in the bigger picture. Others are not seeing it. And so if you just let it go and you know what's going on, you're watching like a car crash into a wall. So then you poke holes at items, and then at the moment it's, you're affecting our comfort and this is slightly annoying. But in the medium to longer term, that saved them from who knows what dynamic in that group.
Armen, on behalf of the human race, I would like to thank you for poking holes and defamiliarizing our safety patterns, and doing this for humanity. So thank you. It means a lot.
On behalf of also the human race, which somehow we're both representative of, we also thank you for the listing would be extensive, but understanding this concept, which does a lot, because just understanding it, it puts it in that space, and then also noting maybe an individual who has that kind of form, and then having some form of that form of one's own, so that
Absolutely.
Earth can be that
and
way.
so for all those annoying people out there, you're doing great work, but not when there's too many of you.
This is, oh yeah, I was going to follow up on that part too. Yes, up to a point, because if there's no shortage of poke holes, now the blanket is no longer a blanket, it is
It's a string.
air pockets. It's a string.
And we're drowning. Yeah.
There's a limit to how much that can be done. So there's like a small percentage that it should be there. It should not be there, but it shouldn't be that the majority is
Feel the
poking at
mood.
everything.
I feel the mood. If you're a true individual, then actually sometimes the most individualistic thing you can do is cooperate when nobody else is.
I have come across that train of thought in my mind, and that is true. Once in a while, that is a very positive place to go. Okay, I am one with the people. We're blending in, and this is good and individual. And it's the kind of, it's backwards though, because the common, let's say a person is seemingly looking at themselves not too unique, then once in a while they're like, I'm unique, but maybe not so much. And then the individual that really is unique, once in a while it's good to just try and blend in, try to fit in somehow, because that is a statement in itself. There's layers to these items. Long live the layers. I think about the layers very much. It's very good to have depth of thought also. I want to bring, that's a good one to point out. It's very good to have depth of layers of thought, because that's where you can really get something. If everything is linear, then it only functions for getting things done, but we don't progress as a people. So that's a concept there. Now, you have talked about anarchism as an ethics of practice rather than a blueprint. How does this perspective help address common criticisms that anarchism is unrealistic or utopian?
Technically, I must admit, if I did take credit for that one, that's very wrong of me, because that was David Graeber's expression, ethics of practice.
No, you did not take credit for it.
Well, I'd love to, but that was all David.
Right.
And I'd actually slightly, just to be awkward, just to be that person poking the hole again. I'd say possibly I come away from that ever so slightly, because that notion of it being an ethics of practice suggests that it's always got to kind of result in some kind of positive activity or positive outcome, whereas sometimes, if we're just sticking to this notion of anarchism as constantly trying to escape from any kind of enclosure or intellectual, emotional, cultural captivity, especially ideological captivity, then, sort of, I think we've got to leave it even freer than that. I think actually sometimes no action is still a perfectly viable a perfectly viable option, as it were. But this idea that of kind of moving anarchism away from people getting too transfixed with this notion of, oh well, is it going to be, do we mean communism, or are we going to have to kind of, is this sort of some kind of rebooted free trade thing, or how is this all about people's forums, or kind of, again, that's another example of people kind of overemphasizing the tools or the examples of anarchy as this kind of spirit or energy in action, and they're really good, and quite a lot of the time there's no reason why a lot of those ideas wouldn't work. Personally speaking, personally only, I do think we would all be, as a world, as a collection of individual communities and societies, but also as a sort of species, I think we would be happier with, broadly speaking, much more equality, and broadly speaking, much more control and sort of kind of freedom to shape our own lives. Of course, I think that, and of course, therefore, there are some fairly sort of clear options for how you might organize or arrange that, particularly in a complex modern society which has a very sort of entangled global economic system and a very kind of no less complex global and entangled social system. But I think, again, sort of that might be, I'm trying to draw a distinction between what I think could work, could happen, what I'd sort of argue for, But anarchy itself, which actually only needs to commit me to kind of challenging the existing sort of assumptions and patterns and ways that I'm living, this notion that there are other possibilities in the world and that they become richer and more interesting. I mean, it's actually just very basic maths. One person alone, is not going to have as much creative reach as if you connect and you collaborate and you work and you cooperate with other people. I mean, it is just, that doesn't mean you have to lose your individual mind to like the hive. It actually is more just a skill that it behoves us all to kind of cultivate, how you function as part of a group without losing yourself in it. I mean, that's, I think, to me, the real essence of anarchy is sociability, is the art of sociability, which we don't prioritize or privilege as much, and yet it's one of the great joys and pleasures that we all experience when we make a connection with other people, when we exchange ideas. The whole spirit of this podcast really is, has got an anarchic spirit. Let's see where we go with this. Let's see if we talk to these people, where we, what doors open that weren't previously. um People kind of think that we're in such a dire moment right now, that what I'm talking about is sheer indulgence. I was at a talk, I gave a talk in Brussels the other day, and there was a woman in the audience who couldn't believe that I had the audacity to sit there and question things like, the sanctity of laws or rights or anything like that, that I was just sitting there being, and I quote, a sort of middle class white academic who just wanted to play with ideas all the time. And my response is, well, where do you think the source material, the raw material, is going to come from for living in any other kind of way? Because as we've already discussed on this program, it's really hard to drop massive, really complex, multifaceted, interconnecting problems such as climate change, such as the kind of climate change induced migration, such as pandemics, such as, AI and the implications that's going to have. It's really difficult to drop them neatly into rules-based systems. It's really difficult. I mean, all you're ever doing with things like laws and rights is trying to curb the worst excesses of power. You're never getting anywhere beyond that. And I want more than beyond that. And I actually think we are suffering from a real want of possibility right now. And you don't get possibility by one person, even a brilliant person, you don't get possibility by one person sitting on their own in a room making a system fit perfectly, without you get it by interaction with other people. And we're just losing the ability to it, and we're losing the joy in doing it. And that's a problem, because that's not gonna help us right now.
This is very true. We are losing that element, and it gets cut off in multiple ways. Someone brings up a thought. Oh, why would you even have that thought? This is the way it is. Okay. Now I want to team up with people. Why would you want to team up with people? You're going to build something from what? No, but it has to be like this based on the laws. But the law is just like a limitation on the top. It's not any sort of build up from the happening. It's like, okay, the speed limit is 65 miles per hour. And so we want to base our day off of the speed limit being 65 miles an hour. That's an awkward way to progress forward.
Again, the technical term, the tail wags the dog one too many times in our lives. Those things were all there for a reason, and probably in some cases very good reasons, but not time immemorial reasons. It's okay to question things. It's okay to see if we need to form new ways of living together.
This is an important point. Let me rehash that one in some form. Yes, it is good to be able to communicate, say things, come up with ideas, try things, make an effort. It doesn't always work out in the process. People connect with people. Maybe you don't connect with all people. You may connect with some more than others. And trying is the good part. If we cut out the trying, there's a lot of not trying or not effort happening all over the place. And that's very easy. It's just something stays at rest that was already at rest.
Exactly. So as I mentioned, the book I shamelessly plugged at the beginning, it's literally a book about people coming up with ideas that essentially fail. And it might seem odd that an intellectual historian would basically look at ideas that didn't work, but actually,
unbelievable.
That culture of experimentation, what attracted me to study it is that I think that's what we need right now. And yet we live in a culture that's so overlain with, like, you can't really do anything without almost guarantee it's going to work. Otherwise you won't get funding for it. You won't get chosen for it, whatever it is. And one of my favorite rants, which I'm sure, which I won't get into now, but it is about how we have based the entire education system on kind of foregone conclusions, on not taking sort of intellectual risks, which ultimately leads us into a culture and a situation and politics of higher risk because we're not taking intellectual risks.
Yes. If it starts to be, okay, this is the thing and we figured out this and this is the thing cemented, and then the person shows up and, oh, okay, I learned those 4 things and that's knowledge, and now you've pinned it down into those 4 things is knowledge. Once you get into the actual world, okay, now I have to be really punchy because it was stuck. It was like it got to a stuck point. You don't want the educational system to get stuck in some way where we got to DNA and we figured out DNA and that is it. And if you study that, you can get a advanced degree, and because you know exactly what we already figured out. You want continuity and progression.
Mm-hmm. A lot of education is based on repeating back what people are confident that they already know, and that gives them pleasure to hear it back to themselves because it's their own image reflected back at them. And it's and look, I've taught too. I find it more rewarding when things are familiar to me and there are things I can speak to competently, and I don't feel kind of I don't sort of feel out of my comfort zone or anything like that. But the minute I know I'm feeling quite secure, I sort of also know I'm not really enjoying any kind of profound learning experience, because you're not, are you? I mean, it's you got to feel the fear. Whereas we are feeling fear now, but in a very different way, not in the nice, safe kind of way that you ought to do in a kind of school situation.
That is true. There are different kinds of
There are
fear that tell us something. They're speaking to us. Any sort of hefty emotion is speaking to us something strongly in preparation, or to think about something, or to build up for that. We don't want to discount these feelings because they're like a loud message, like clear. You might want to do this. This would be good. And that's like our intelligence is kicking in right there.
Yeah.
Now, you have mentioned Graeber a couple of times. He wrote a book called BS Jobs, and he wrote very many things. And I've thought quite a bit about the occupational world and what people are doing. And so currently we have, let's say, AI soon being able to handle various ones. What are your thoughts on, I have this concept that individuals are defending jobs that they probably didn't even want in the first place. Like, let's say if I ask the 6-year-old, hey, do you want to do XYZ? I won't pick an actual one. Maybe they wouldn't have picked this one, and then later on they're doing that, and then when that job gets removed due to AI, then they're like, oh no, darn it. But I would contend they didn't even really want to do it in the first place. It was just something that was valuable for the current time frame, and they fit into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, the other sort of great virtue with this kind of critical, creative tango that I'm attributing to Anarchy is that Anarchy gives you a wonderful critical lens on things. And one of the things it's really good, because it's so obsessed with escaping from authority, it's got a really amazing ability to magnify it in any given situation because it's looking for it in order to escape from it. And the I situation is a fairly classic one. In some senses, I mean, there's sort of, I think a lot of the fear is because actually no one's kind of telling anyone what the alternatives would be in terms of how you have a livelihood. A lot of people are doing jobs they don't want, but they're not doing them because they've, wanted nothing more than to sell, administrate, whatever it may be. But no one's answered the question for them if they all get laid off. Okay, so if someone was saying, we don't need all these useless jobs anymore, AI can do it all and do it all really cost effectively. And that, by the way, I'm not going to get into the kind of, in this particular answer about the kind of whole issue with AI. I'm bracketing that for the time being, just focusing on the jobs element. So what's going to happen to them? People were saying, right, well, that's fine because now we're going to give you universal basic income, or other things that were muted in a lot of the kind of futurist sort of agendas was the idea that people would be paid to be consumers, right? Because we live in a consumer economy, so actually why not pay people to be consumers? What a fantastic idea. I mean, we sort of laugh at that now because we're so in the kind of neoliberal zone, which is this wonderfully strange combination of the worst aspects of capitalism with the worst aspects of feudalism. So this wonderfully sort of, we want the market, but we also want to control the bejesus out of you, which is, you know, a charming experience for everybody. But yeah, I think a lot of the objections are purely because no one's answering seriously the question of how anyone's going to survive. So what's going to be left? I mean, does that mean that if we get rid of all those kind of sort of low-level calculating type jobs that require, let's face it, as we've already discussed, fairly minimal human imagination, creativity, inspiration, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I don't think anyone's going to be grieving that they're not doing that precise job anymore, although there are other elements to a workplace that people do value, even if they don't love the actual job they're doing. They like the companionship, they like the structure, they like, you know, kind of, I don't know, the water cooler. There's a variety of reasons why you might enjoy a space aside from the task that you're doing. But right now, instead of, you know, living lives of luxury, it's looking more like people will be pressed back down into situations of menial labor, which, you know, kind of, which just need sheer human grunt, you know, of some description. And that's even less attractive than sitting behind a computer all day. So we have, I mean, it's in some ways it's quite remarkable how I think we have created a weird situation where we're going to fight for jobs that are actually crushing the life out of it. Although, as I said, with the caveat that people find other forms of satisfaction through being in workplaces. That said, what's also happening right now is, you know, work is a real battleground at the moment. We are seeing some really interesting trends, certainly over here, and I imagine they're coming from the US. They normally do in the first instance. So quiet quitting, for example, people who are just, this is so much of a waste of my time and my energy. I'm going to just go into slow-mo, like literally hibernation mode. I'll just TikTok by. That's just as in the clock. And I will and I'll just get through to the end of the day. Or there is kind of the work from home battle raging at the moment, where a lot of these sort of big CEO types saying get back into the office. And people really actually, we often worry that we're living through such a sort of moment of docility amongst many people, but actually we're seeing people really resist some of these things. So that tells me, I think, again, my form of anarchism always says work with the currents that are available to hand. Don't try and invent whole new situations before you can do anything. There are currents already to hand, and I think a lot of people right now are thinking really hard about what it means to work, how precarious that is, how fragile, therefore, everything is around them. So, you know, how they hold their house, how they kind of feed their families, how they heat themselves in the cold, you know, sort of when one straw breaks, you know, it's amazing what else is going to come unraveling fast. And it's astonishing to me that the political system is so wildly kind of out of control now that it's not even trying to do the very sheer basics to protect itself from a collapse that's almost certainly going to kind of rouse people against it.
Does seem it does seem a bit like that, like
Sorry.
it's going in that direction, a wave that is going in one way, and how can that wave be stopped? And also, I was thinking of the metaphor of the wave. Is an anarchist like an individual where there's already an ocean wave going? They go on the wave, but then they guide it a bit using what's already occurring. Is that a reasonable metaphor?
Yeah, I think, like I said, if we're going to if we're going to continue with this notion that anarchism, I mean, another metaphor I like to torture when it comes to anarchy
We
is
love
this idea of it
metaphors.
being a quantum philosophy, right? So it doesn't stay one thing or other, but it's very respondent to the kind of context or situation that it's inhabiting. And therefore, actually, you know, I think that notion of if we want to talk about people gaining more control, but we don't immediately want to situate that within a kind of neo-republic or a sort of commune or any of the other kind of sort of conventional traditional ways of talking about that, but we want to say, right, well, actually just look around you, do a bit of a life audit. Most people at some point have to kind of interact with the question of work, how they're going to make an income, whatever. And that's actually right now, that is possibly the place where the majority of people are going to start really feeling the reality or the truth about a lot of what kind of activists or various other people have been sort of alarming and shouting about, often quite frighteningly, for a long time. Like you never kind of really, I don't think you never unless it feels real to you and you are living, you are living the experience of some of these abstract concepts like neoliberalism or kind of climate change or social collapse sort of thing. You just, it takes infinitely more energy to keep caring about an abstract concept than it is to engage with a living experience. So if there are, the workplace right now is in a really, there's AI, there's kind of sort of huge amounts of pressure and cuts around certain industries or certain areas. There is huge amounts of kind of trade, well, imminent trade wars coming down the road. This is going to be a space where a lot of people are going to have an immediate stake in the future. So yeah, it's certainly a space for anarchy.
That concept is used to push away the thought because, oh, you're staying in the abstract, but we need something today to make the solution for this thing. But the abstract would be, it would handle the long term if we could stay in that and then attach it to reality as goes on.
Yeah, but I think always, kind of, again, it's that combination. So when people say they want concrete solutions, and they say it to me quite a lot, well, can you give me because it's still that solutions driven mentality, like, well, this is all hot air until you give me a solution. So it's almost like they're insisting I contradict myself, which I object, frankly. However,
she objects.
I object. But to me, my reply as well, in a kind of snooty way, is, well, that's actually abstract empiricism, because what you're wanting me to do is give you a concrete example of an abstract notion, which is what. So if I describe to you how a communistic system would work, and then you can turn around and say, oh, well, that you've given me lots of detail, but it's all still not real. Whereas actually, what I'm demanding is I'm admitting that I can't possibly have an overview of every possible space where anarchy might apply or be applied, right? But I can say to you, well, have a look at where you inhabit in your life. Are there any, unless you are utterly content with absolutely everything, in which case your version of anarchy might be fighting to keep that contentment. And so long as you're not coercive about it, okay, fair enough. That's another valid opinion. But there'll be somewhere in your life where you want to exercise more control, you want to have more input, you want to retain more satisfaction, or maybe it's not a positive instinct, maybe it's a negative one. Maybe you're not feeling gratified or excited or interested, or maybe you're just not feeling anything. Maybe that in itself is sufficient of a kind of invitation to anarchy, if you will.
Oh, strong points right there. Yes. Sometimes you'll get a counter force because the individual is looking to step on something. So much has been stepping on them or their being, and so, okay, I got to pass this off. Oh, you have an idea, but it's not concrete? No. I only live in a concrete world. Boom. I'm happy for the next 30 minutes. There's a little bit of a positive feeling that comes from that. I always think of people in these examples and relationships and how people get along and group dynamics as well.
Yeah.
Abstract is important to keep. It's important to keep in the mind. Now, you have done wonderful talks in very many places, which I'm going to link from this talk here. One of the wonderful talks you have done is at the Institute of Art and Ideas, which is, they have so many videos, and one of your videos is one of their top videos. I'm not sure if you know that, but long live that. Now, also on the Institute of Art and Ideas, has been a past guest of mine, Daniel Markovits. He's been on twice, and he has spoken about meritocracy and how we want things to be based on merit. And this has come up recently in the last few weeks publicly about it being merit-based versus handed over in some form. What are your thoughts on meritocracy, that merit gets rewarded, and do we live in something like that?
Well, okay, so I can do the first one quickly. No, we don't. The second one is I have a huge problem with meritocracy, because my first question is always, well, who's deciding what merit is? It's always taken. I mean, you can either take the pragmatic answer, which is, well, there is no kind of natural merit, but we have a societal definition which helps people get on in the worlds that they live in, and it should be contextual and aligned into the kind of culture and society people are living in. But again, I'd say, well, actually, you look closely at that, and that's never sort of as disinterested or as indifferent as that might appear. So I think it's been a particularly damaging concept in education, not least because it is a new way. And actually, and again, I'm gonna sound like I'm coming up with brilliant ideas. In fact, the originator of this idea was Michael Young in 1957 when he writes the satire, The Rise of the Meritocracy, and he just points out actually it's a new way of instating a class system, but with a sort of added nuance that. So whereas once people used to be able to feel assured of their social status because they could invoke hereditary birthrights sort of thing, now they can do it because they're the cleverest, they're the most meritorial, and they earned it, they worked hard, and they had the IQ plus effort. Aren't they excellent people? They deserve to have more of a say in things than the Dumbo plebs who didn't work hard, and even if they did, weren't smart anyway. So it's a massively problematic concept. So there are ways people try and refine it. I've been kind of slightly alarmed to see an increased interest in this interesting notion, epistocracy, that's a genuine alternative to kind of the sort of that's a new way that we could organize politics that actually just not technocracy that used to be ruled by experts, but no, we're not doing that because that's a little bit blunt and it's a little bit as you were saying earlier, linear and a bit instrumental. But if we call it epistocracy, I'm not even sure I'm saying it right, then we can sort of lever in a bit of room for critical thinking and reflectivity too. But there'll be a group of people who can do that really well, and they should be at the top, and they should be telling everyone else what to do. And it's not far off John Stuart Mill saying, oh, do you know what, smart people should have 2 votes and dumb people should have 1, because then you won't get tyranny of the majority. Sorry folks, but actually I just can't see the world like that, and I don't want to. I mean, I think we again overfixate on particular forms of expression as being markers of greater sophistication. Now, actually, in some, so I'm going to tread a little bit carefully here. I'm not saying, I'm not everyone's equally clever or whatever. No, but actually, when it comes to something like democracy, I don't think that matters so much as that everyone's got experience and everyone's alive in this world, and therefore everyone's got some sort of relevant contribution to make to, what is democracy? It is an attempt to shape a reasonably acceptable pattern amongst a group of people who happen to be living together. And obviously that's much easier to do when they're actual people in an actual space rather than imaginary people in an imagined sort of conceptual space. So I enjoy clever people whose ideas move around and who have huge ranges and repertoires of thoughts to draw on. And I get bored sometimes when I'm talking with people who don't seem to have that kind of a repertoire. I always bear in mind, well, where's the class element coming in here? How much opportunity has this person had to be exposed to different things? But equally, I would point to my favorite writer, Jane Austen, who lived an incredibly narrow, sheltered life and still managed to make gold out of basically bonnet buying and other such exciting activities as that. So was still able to be incredibly creative on what was ostensibly very thin material. So this is a sort of very long way of saying, no, meritocracy is another crappy way for a certain strata of society to say, well, so long as everyone looks kind of a bit like us, then they should be in power. And I'm like, no, it's not good enough. I think if everyone's having some sort of life, they've got some sort of experience, and they can make some sort of contribution, which the intellectual quality will come with what the group can do with that experience. So you mentioned a few minutes ago group dynamics. That's a really interesting and relatively forgotten kind of social science that emerged through Kurt Lewin and the National Training Laboratory in 1947 in the post-war period, ironically funded by the US Naval Office, until they realized that it was actually quite radically democratic. And the principle behind group dynamics, usually the idea is, we'll do some psychology to make sure that the errant, misfit individual can be slotted much more gracefully into the group. But what Kurt Lewin and his fellow researchers said was, no. Every kind of conflict, every kind of tension is a source of creativity for the group. It's going to be the means by which the group adjusts itself, adapts, modifies. That doesn't mean it always plays to the person whinging the loudest, but that is a trigger for a process of reflecting and re-examining and recreating and reinventing itself. So, no to meritocracy, basically, in essence. That's what I think.
Classic. I should use 2025 style description. Sophie crushed meritocracy. That would be the people love it. 3 ways Sophie drowned meritocracy in the ocean. Classic. It's very, that concept is something, because let's say it's always taking this is my theme that just came from what you said. Anarchists have to be very careful, because there's a message being described, and then the others that are not of that form or not currently doing that. Okay, how do we fit what you're describing into some element of what we already have, or some version that's actually not that, and look like we're taking it into account, but not actually taking it into account because I'm comfortable with this thing that's been here.
Yeah. So where do we start, basically? How could we start?
The question I just came up with completely on my own creatively. How do we start?
Okay. Well, first of all, just look around. Again, if you take the basic starting point for Anarchy is this critical, creative kind of outlook. So just, kind of right now, there are 2 ways to anarchize your life a bit more super quickly. One of them is simply that you have that critical energy that starts looking around, and it starts saying, one of the more oft quoted anarchists from sort of early 20th century, Gustav Landauer. He had this lovely phrase: the state is a relationship, and we change the state by changing our relationship. Now, I personally think that might be a little bit too romanticized, but there's enough in it. There's enough substance in that thought that we can work with that. So the first thing is just to start thinking a lot more critically and a lot less incredulously about power. So okay, audience member in Brussels, it is fine to question laws and rights. It is fine to question what they're doing for us and who they're really defending, who they're defending on the surface, but what they're facilitating under the surface. It is okay to question and challenge anything, and to get that joy and that buzz back. Interestingly, right now, a lot of universities, which were traditionally the places, true, traditionally the places, well, actually, I say that, they have been considered traditionally the places where this sort of critical thinking happens. In actual fact, for the majority of the history of the university, they were establishment, and they were entirely sort of propped up by, they were entirely there for the purpose of propping up the establishment. So there was a short window, somewhere between the 60s and the 90s, where they became more of this site of critical thinking, largely because the independent sphere, the public marketplace, if you like, of of kind of comment and criticism shut down or collapse independent publishing and what have you. Right now, and like with a show exactly like this, so again, thank you on behalf of the human race, Armen, we're finding new ways to reinvigorate that. So actually we don't need to do all our critical thinking on within university settings. There are new spaces emerging. Yeah, we've got to navigate them carefully, because otherwise we just find our way into echo chambers and people tell us what we want to hear. We pat ourselves on the back and we don't learn, we don't grow, etc. and so forth. So the first thing you can do is just start giving voice. If there's something in you, just go with that feeling. If you just feel that things aren't quite right, just start articulating it and find other people to do that with. That's the other thing. Don't just sit there on your own or sit there with people you can't see or interact with, and just carping about the world. Go and find out who else is feeling bad, because an individual is important, and I would never abandon kind of, we've already discussed this, the individual is this wonderful kind of source of energy and kind of contrariness, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, actually, we're not going to get a fraction of the imaginative power on our own as we are when we go out and we connect with other people. So start complaining and go and find others to do it with, and then in that process maybe you can start creating too. And invent some new spaces, just like this podcast. Invent some new spaces. If you're not getting heard, create a space where you can get heard. How the lights get in, you've mentioned Institute of Art and Ideas. People are popping up all over the place. They're creating new spaces to talk, but the emphasis there is it's got to be conversation, right? Not on your own with preaching to the choir. You've got to, sort of take your ideas out and exchange them with people who may not agree with you, but who may introduce you to whole new areas of experience that are not in your world right now.
Complain and create. There's alliteration there.
Complain and create. Yes.
We want to do these two things and speak our voice as much as is applicable. That's a strong point.
Perfect.
Frankly,
beautifully put.
That one right there, I will leave it at there for this time, and we will save the other items for a future time. That is very poignant. That's a practical usage, actually, complain and create, for the person that's looking for a practical way to do things. On this one here, Sophie, I would like to thank you for joining for this discussion. We would be glad to have you back and informing us quite a bit about anarchy, some of these messages from different anarchists, some messages you have spoken about, meritocracy, and more. And we are out.